The journey ended as it had begun, with a violent lurch and a cloud of dust thick enough to taste. For 3 weeks, this rolling, creaking box had been Eliza Reed's world, a cramped universe of cracked leather, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the relentless, punishing rhythm of the trail. The sun had baked the paint off the exterior and turned the inside into an oven. She could feel the grit of the plains in her teeth, in the folds of her dress, and deep in her lungs. The coachman's gruff voice bellowed something about Prosperity Creek, a name so steeped in irony it might have been a joke. There was no sound of a creek, only the dry, whispering sigh of a wind that carried no relief. The other passengers, a sweat-stained prospector and a nervous young couple who hadn't spoken a word in 2 days, stirred with a weary urgency, eager to escape the confinement. Eliza remained still, her hands folded over her small, worn carpet bag. This was it, the end of the line, the edge of the world she knew, and the beginning of something else. She took a moment, a single, stolen breath in the stifling heat, to gather herself. She was not the same woman who had boarded this stage in St. Louis, fleeing the smoldering ruins of her life. That woman had been frantic, her heart a raw, open wound. This woman, the one who sat poised in the dust-choked gloom, was forged of something harder. She had to be. The coach door swung open, flooding the interior with a blinding, white-hot glare. The prospector scrambled out first, then the husband, who turned to help his pale, wilting wife. Then, the space was empty. The coachman, a silhouette against the sun, grunted impatiently. "End of the road, ma'am." Eliza moved with a deliberate slowness that was not born of weariness, but of resolve. She gathered the skirts of her dark blue traveling dress, a garment of good wool that was far too heavy for this climate, and marked her as an outsider more than any accent ever could. As she descended the high steps, she kept her eyes down, her bonnet shielding her face. She felt the ground beneath her worn leather boots solid, unyielding, and covered in a fine, rust-colored dust that immediately coated them. Then she looked up, and the world stopped. It wasn't a loud halt, but a slow, creeping silence. The clang of a hammer on an anvil at the blacksmith's shop ceased mid-swing. The low murmur of conversation from the men lounging on the porch of the general store faded into nothing. Even the 2 women in gingham dresses, who had been shaking out a rug on the boardwalk, froze with their hands in the air. Prosperity Creek, it seemed, was not accustomed to visitors like her. Not a woman, alone, stepping out of a stagecoach with no one to meet her. The town was little more than a single, wide street carved from the unforgiving earth. On either side stood a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings, their facades squinting in the perpetual sun. A saloon with swinging doors, a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, and a few other nondescript structures huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty prairie that stretched out in every direction. The sky above was a merciless, pale blue, vast and empty, a canvas for the heat and the dust. Every eye was on her. She could feel their gazes like a physical touch, heavy, probing, and deeply suspicious. They were reading her story before she had a chance to tell it. They saw the quality of her dress, a hint of Eastern money, but noted its travel-worn state. They saw the lack of a wedding band on her gloved hand. They saw the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but also the straightness of her spine, a defiance that did not belong to a helpless widow or a timid mail-order bride. A woman traveling alone in these parts was a question, and most of the answers were not respectable. Eliza knew this look. She had seen it before, in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia. It was the same look of appraisal, of judgment, just stripped of its silken gloves and polite veneer. In the East, the whispers had been like the rustle of silk behind gloved hands. Here, the silence was as loud as a gunshot. She remembered her father's face, a mask of cold fury and disappointment. "You have made your bed." "Eliza," he had said, his voice void of the warmth she had known as a child, "you have ruined the family name with your foolishness. There is no place for you here." Her foolishness had been to fall in love with a man her family deemed unsuitable an artist, a man of passion and no fortune, and to refuse to give him up, even when the relationship became a public scandal. The ultimate sin for a woman of her standing was not the love itself, but the refusal to be ashamed of it. When he had died of a fever, she was left with nothing but a reputation in tatters and a family that treated her like a ghost in her own home. So she had taken what little inheritance her mother had left her, packed a single bag, and bought a ticket west, as far west as the money would take her. She hadn't been running toward anything specific, only away from the suffocating cage of expectations and the cold, unforgiving eyes of her past. Now, standing in the dusty main street of Prosperity Creek, she found herself facing a new kind of cage, a new set of eyes. These were harder, more direct. They were the eyes of people who wrestled a living from the dirt, who understood survival in its rawest form. They judged not by family name, but by utility. And a lone woman of her apparent breeding had no utility here. She was a curiosity, a potential problem, a deviation from the harsh order of their lives. The stagecoach driver tossed her bag onto the ground with a thud, raising another puff of red dust. "That'll be all?" he said, already climbing back onto his seat, eager to be on his way. The stagecoach was her last link to the world she had left, and as the harnesses jingled and the great wheels began to creak and turn, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of being utterly adrift. She squared her shoulders. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She picked up her bag, the handle digging into her palm. Her plan was simple: find the boarding house, secure a room, and then figure out the rest. One step at a time. That was how you survived. Her walk from the center of the street to the raised boardwalk felt 100 miles long. Each footstep was a conscious effort. She did not hurry. She did not look at the ground. She kept her gaze fixed on the far end of the street, where a slightly larger two-story building had a faded sign that read, "Boarding House, Rooms and Meals." As she passed the general store, the men on the porch did not so much as nod. They simply watched, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, startlingly close to the hem of her skirt. It was a gesture of casual contempt, a way of marking territory. Eliza didn't flinch, didn't even break her stride. To react was to show weakness. The two women with the rug had resumed their work, but their movements were stiff. Their heads turned just enough to keep her in their peripheral vision. Their whispers were now audible, a low, sibilant hiss carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew their content. Alone. Look at her clothes. Who is she? What does she want here? She felt a flicker of the old anger, the same burning indignation that had gotten her into so much trouble before, the desire to turn, to fix them with a glare, and ask what business it was of theirs. But she smothered it. That was the old Eliza. The new Eliza understood that survival here meant learning a different set of rules. It meant being quiet, being watchful, and keeping her own counsel. A small child, a boy with hair the color of straw and a face smudged with dirt, darted out from between two buildings, chasing a hoop with a stick. He stopped dead when he saw her, his mouth falling open in a small "oh" of surprise. He had likely never seen a woman dressed as she was, a figure of dark, severe elegance in a world of homespun cotton and worn denim. For a moment, his gaze was one of pure, unadulterated curiosity, free of the judgment of his elders. He was simply seeing, not concluding. It was a small, unexpected mercy. Then his mother's sharp voice called from a doorway, and he scurried away as if Eliza were a phantom to be feared. The sun beat down on the back of her neck. A trickle of sweat traced a path down her spine. The dust, the heat, the oppressive silence, and the weight of 100 unseen judgments pressed in on her. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The sheer, overwhelming loneliness of her situation threatened to swamp her. What was she doing here? What possible life could she build in a place that had already decided to reject her? This wasn't a new beginning. It was just a different kind of prison, one with wider walls and a harsher sun. But then she remembered the alternative, the quiet suffocation of her father's house, the pitying glances, the life of a spinster aunt living on sufferance, forever paying penance for a love that had been her only true act of freedom. No, she would rather face the honest hostility of the frontier than the polite, soul-crushing contempt of society. Here, at least, the struggle was out in the open. Here, a person was measured by what they could endure. She had reached the boarding house. The porch steps groaned under her weight. The front door was closed. Presenting a solid, impassive face, she paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and took one last look back down the street. The town was slowly coming back to life. The blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic ringing again. The men on the porch had resumed their low conversation, though their heads were still turned in her direction. The stagecoach was a dwindling speck on the horizon, taking the last of her old world with it. She was an island, a solitary figure in a vast and indifferent landscape. The people here were not her friends. They were obstacles, judges, a chorus of suspicion she would have to overcome every single day. She had come to the West seeking freedom, but she had found only a new form of exile. Eliza Reed took a deep, steadying breath, the hot, dusty air filling her lungs. She turned the knob and pushed the door open, stepping out of the searing sunlight and into the cool, dark unknown of her new life. The door swung shut behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing the finality of a choice from which there was no turning back. The room in the boarding house was clean, but stark. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a single wooden chair, and a window that looked out onto a dusty alley. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard years and suspicion, had made it clear that while the room was paid for the week, meals were another matter. "Kitchen's closed after midday," she'd stated, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "If you want a hot supper, there's only one place serves it, the Gilded Nugget Saloon. They have a decent stew." She'd said the word saloon with a slight curl of her lip, her eyes raking over Eliza's fine dress with a meaning that was perfectly clear. A place like that was no place for a lady. But then, what was a lady doing here alone anyway? The thought of entering such an establishment sent a cold spike of apprehension through Eliza. In her former life, the mere mention of a woman going to a saloon unescorted would have been cause for immediate and total ruin. But hunger was a more pressing concern than propriety. She hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days, subsisting on dry biscuits and lukewarm water from her canteen. Her pride was a poor substitute for food. Survival, she was learning, meant swallowing pride along with everything else. As dusk settled, bleeding purple and orange into the vast sky, Eliza left the relative safety of her room. The air had cooled slightly, but the dust still hung in the street, catching the golden lamplight that began to spill from windows. The Gilded Nugget was unmistakable. It was the loudest, brightest building on the street, emitting a discordant clamor of tinny piano music, rough laughter, and the clink of glasses. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she pushed through the swinging half-doors. The noise hit her first, a wave of sound so thick it felt like she could drown in it. The air was close and heavy with the smells of stale whiskey, sweat, unlit cigars, and something vaguely sour. The light was dim, coming from a few kerosene lamps that cast long, dancing shadows and painted everything in a grimy, yellow hue. The room was crowded with men prospectors, ranch hands, drifters, all of them loud, rough, and deeply absorbed in their drink and their cards. Her entrance had the same effect it had had earlier in the day, but magnified tenfold. The piano player's hands fumbled on the keys, creating a jarring chord that hung in the air as the music died. Conversation sputtered out, Heads turned. A sea of weathered, whiskered faces turned towards the door, their expressions ranging from disbelief to raw, predatory curiosity. In this world of coarse wool and worn leather, she was a specter from another planet, her dark, well-cut dress and her refined posture an accusation of softness and privilege. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Even the barkeep, a burly man with a stained apron and a perpetually sour expression, stopped polishing a glass to stare. For a paralyzing moment, Eliza wanted nothing more than to turn and flee back into the relative anonymity of the night. But she felt all those eyes on her back, and she knew that to retreat now would be to mark herself as prey, with a resolve she had to manufacture from sheer will. She moved further into the room, her gaze fixed on a small, empty table in a corner, far from the boisterous card games. Her every movement was tracked. She felt like an actress on a stage, every nuance of her posture, every rustle of her skirts, being scrutinized and judged by a hostile audience. She reached the table and sat, placing her gloved hands in her lap. She kept her back straight, her chin up, a perfect portrait of composure she did not feel. The barkeep finally seemed to shake himself from his stupor. He lumbered over, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "What'll it be?" he grunted, not bothering with any pretense of welcome. "Your stew, please," Eliza said, her voice quiet but clear. "And a glass of water." He grunted again and left. The silence he left behind was quickly filled. A low chuckle came from a nearby table where 4 cowboys were playing poker. One of them, a lanky man with a sly, unpleasant grin and a shock of greasy red hair, leaned back in his chair, tipping it onto 2 legs. Well, Sully," he said to the man across from him, his voice loud enough to carry through the entire room. "Looks like a lost little canary flew in from the east." The man named Sully, bigger than the others with a broad, brutish face, took a swig of his whiskey and eyed Eliza from head to toe. "Don't look lost to me, Slim. Looks like she knows exactly where she is. Probably looking for a new business opportunity." The table erupted in coarse laughter. Eliza's face burned, but she refused to look at them. She focused on a knot in the wooden tabletop, tracing its whorls with her eyes, praying for the barkeep to return. To acknowledge them would be to engage, and to engage would be to lose. The barkeep returned and slammed a bowl of steaming, savory-smelling stew and a glass of water on her table. Some of the stew slopped over the side. He left without a word. Eliza picked up the spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She told herself to eat, to gain strength, to ignore them, just eat and leave. But they weren't done. Her silence was a challenge. "Too good to talk to us," Little Lady Slim called out. "What's the matter? Our money not good enough for your kind." "Maybe she can't talk," another one chimed in. "Maybe she's just for looking at. A pretty little doll like that must cost a pretty penny." Eliza took a spoonful of stew. It was hot and filling, and she forced herself to chew and swallow, to act as if she were alone in the room, deaf to their provocations. But her stomach was a tight knot of fear, and every shadow in the saloon seemed to be closing in. The other patrons were watching the spectacle, some with mild amusement, others with indifference. No one was going to help. She was on her own. Sully pushed his chair back with a loud scrape. He stood up, his bulk blocking the lamplight. He was drunk, and his eyes had a mean, glassy sheen. He swaggered toward her table, his spurs jingling a menacing rhythm on the floorboards. "I said," he began, his voice a low growl as he loomed over her. "Are you too good for us?" He reached out a grimy hand, not to touch her, but to rest it on the table next to her bowl. A clear act of intimidation. The smell of whiskey and unwashed sweat rolled off him, and Eliza had to fight the urge to recoil. She slowly placed her spoon down. She raised her head and finally met his gaze. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her eyes were steady. "I am here to eat my supper, sir. That is all." Her calm, formal address seemed to enrage him more than any outburst would have. It was a language he didn't understand, from a world that had always excluded him. "Sir," he sneered, leaning closer. "She calls me sir. Boys, we got a real princess here. Maybe she needs to be taught some proper frontier manners." He started to reach for her arm. "Let her be! Sully!" The voice came from the darkest corner of the saloon. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. It was low, calm, and carried an absolute, unquestionable authority. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Every head, including Sully's, swiveled toward the source. Eliza followed their gaze. A man sat alone at a table she hadn't even noticed, a half-empty glass of whiskey before him. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his head. He was just sitting there, his hat tilted low, casting his face in deep shadow. All she could see was a strong jawline, dark with stubble, and the outline of a lean, hard frame. He seemed to absorb the shadows around him, a figure of quiet stillness in a room full of noise. Sully hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. He was bigger than the man in the corner, but something in that voice gave him pause. "This ain't your business." "Thorn," he snarled, trying to regain his bluster. The man, Thorn, slowly looked up. He pushed his hat back with a thumb, and for the first time, Eliza saw his face. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines that spoke of hardship and long miles. But it was a strong face, and his eyes were a startling, clear gray, like a winter sky. They were steady, watchful, and intelligent. And at that moment, they were fixed on Sully with an unnerving intensity. "A man bothering a woman while she's eating. That makes it my business," he said, his voice still low and even. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. The threat was not in his volume, but in the utter lack of emotion, the promise of swift, efficient violence that lay just beneath the surface. Sully looked from the quiet man to Eliza and back again. The other men at his table were silent, their drunken bravado evaporated. They knew this man, Thorn. They knew what he was capable of. A tense, humming silence fell over the gilded nugget. The piano player remained frozen. The barkeep gripped the edge of his bar. It was a standoff, a test of wills played out in the smoky gloom. Finally, with a curse muttered under his breath, Sully lowered his hand. He shot Eliza a look of pure venom, then turned and stomped back to his table, his humiliation radiating from him like heat. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway," he grumbled to his friends, who suddenly found their cards very interesting. The tension in the room broke. The piano player hesitantly began a new, softer tune. Men turned back to their drinks, conversations restarting in a muted buzz. The show was over. Eliza felt the breath she'd been holding rush out of her in a shaky exhale. Her entire body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline. She looked across the room to the corner table, intending to offer a nod of thanks to her unlikely defender. Caleb Thorne was already looking at her. His gaze was not like the others. It was not leering or judging. It was assessing. He looked at her not as a canary or a princess, but as a person. His gray eyes held hers across the shadowed room, and in that long, silent moment, a strange and unspoken understanding passed between them. He saw the fear she had worked so hard to conceal, but he also saw the iron core of defiance that had kept her from breaking. She, in turn, saw not a ruffian or a brute, but a quiet strength, a stillness that was a form of power more potent than all the drunken noise in the world. There was a flicker of something in his expression, surprise, perhaps, at finding her resolve. It was a moment of profound and unexpected connection, a silent acknowledgement of two solitary people in a hostile world. He gave her a nod, so slight it was barely perceptible, a gesture of dismissal and respect all at once. Then he looked down at his glass, picked it up, and drained it in one smooth motion. He placed a few coins on the table, stood, and walked toward the door, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't look at her again. As he passed through the swinging doors and disappeared into the night, Eliza was left in the quiet of his wake. She picked up her spoon and, with a steady hand, began to eat her stew. The food tasted better now. The room no longer felt quite so menacing. Something had changed. She was still alone, but for the first time since arriving in Prosperity Creek, she didn't feel entirely without an ally. The walk back to the boarding house was a journey through a different town than the one she had entered. The oppressive heat of the day had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, dry air that felt clean in her lungs. A sliver of moon hung in an ink-black sky strewn with a brilliant spray of stars, more stars than she had ever seen in the smoke-hazed skies of Philadelphia. The lamplight from the windows cast long, soft rectangles onto the dusty street, creating islands of gold in the deep, velvety darkness. The raucous noise of the saloon faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of the prairie wind and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. It was a beautiful night, stark and lonely, and for a moment, Eliza felt a sense of peace. The stew had settled her hunger, and the quiet defense from the man named Thorne had settled. However, briefly, her fear. She walked with her head high, her footsteps making soft, rhythmic puffs in the thick dust. She felt the eyes of the town on her still, peering from behind curtained windows, but they seemed less threatening now. The immediate danger had passed. She replayed the scene in the saloon in her mind, not the insults from the drunken cowboys, but the moment Thorne had spoken. His voice, calm and low, had held more power than all their boisterous threats combined. It was the power of a man who knew his own capabilities and had no need to advertise them. He had not postured or shouted. He had simply stated a fact, and the entire room had bent to his will. She had known powerful men before, men of wealth and political influence in the East. Their power was in their names, their bank accounts, their connections. This man's power was entirely self-contained. It resided in him, in the stillness of his posture and the chilling certainty in his gray eyes. A part of her, the part that had been raised to be a lady, was deeply unsettled by him. He was everything her father would have despised, a rough, unrefined man of the frontier. A man who likely lived by a code of violence and settled disputes with his fists or a gun. But another part of her, the part that had been forged in the crucible of her own quiet rebellion and subsequent exile, recognized something in him, a kind of integrity. It was a harsh, unforgiving integrity, perhaps, but it was real. He hadn't intervened to win her favor or to make a show of his own gallantry. He had done it, she sensed, because he had a line, and Sully had crossed it. It was as simple and as absolute as that. She was so lost in these thoughts that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were almost upon her. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she whirled around, her hand flying to her chest. He was standing not 10 feet away, a tall, lean silhouette against the distant light of the saloon. It was Thorne. He had moved with the silence of a predator, and the realization sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. He stopped when she turned, holding up a hand, not in a threatening way, but in a gesture meant to placate. "Didn't mean to startle you, ma'am." His voice was the same as it had been in the saloon, low and calm. In the open air, it seemed even quieter, a gravelly murmur that was almost lost to the wind. "What do you want?" Eliza asked, her voice sharper than she intended. She took a half-step back, putting more distance between them. She was grateful for his help. But that gratitude did not extend to a moonlit rendezvous on a deserted street. She had learned the hard way that a man's help often came with an unspoken invoice. He seemed to understand her apprehension. He didn't move any closer. "Just wanted to see you got back all right. Men like Sully have long memories for when they've been made to look foolish." "I can take care of myself," she said. the words stiff with a pride that felt brittle even to her own ears. He was silent for a moment, his face mostly in shadow, but she could feel his gaze on her, steady and assessing. "I saw your hands," he said, an observation so unexpected it caught her completely off guard. "My hands?" "In the saloon, when you put them on the table. They're not the hands of a woman who's ever been helpless." She instinctively glanced down at her own hands, still covered by her traveling gloves. It was true, beneath the gloves. Her fingers were calloused and pricked from years of needlework, the one respectable skill she possessed that had also been her secret solace. "You look like you know your way around a needle and thread." She said nothing, her surprise rendering her mute. He had seen past the expensive dress and the Eastern manners to something real, something essential about her. It was unnerving. "Martha Blackwood, the blacksmith's wife," he continued, as if giving a report. "Her eyesight is failing, and she has more mending work than she can handle from the ranches. She's an honest woman, pays fairly. You should talk to her in the morning." He had just offered her a lifeline, a path to the very independence she so desperately craved. He had given her a name, a purpose, a way to start building a life here. And yet, the offer felt like a weight, another link in a chain of obligation she did not want. To accept his help would be to admit she needed it. It would put her in his debt, and she had a deep, visceral distrust of being in any man's debt. She straightened her spine, calling upon the same cold reserve that had been her armor in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne, and for your assistance earlier, but I did not ask for it, and I do not require any more of it." She saw his head tilt slightly, a gesture of curiosity. "No, no," she said, her voice firm. She looked him in the eye, or where she imagined his eyes were in the shadows of his hat. She had to make the lines clear. "Right here, right now. I appreciate the thought, but you and I are from different worlds. I am not your kind of woman." The words hung in the cool night air between them. It was a declaration, a drawing of a boundary line in the dust. She was saying more than the words themselves conveyed. "I am not a saloon girl. I am not a lost dove to be rescued. I am not a woman who repays favors with her company." It was the harshest, most definitive dismissal she could muster. She expected him to be insulted, to perhaps turn and walk away with a gruff curse, or worse, to laugh at her presumption. He did neither. He was silent for a long moment, and the quiet stretched out, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The cool detachment was gone, replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was not anger, but a low, resonant intensity that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Maybe not," he said, and the two words were a quiet concession, an agreement with her assessment of their differences. He took a single, slow step forward, out of the deepest shadow and into the soft moonlight. She could see his face more clearly now, the hard lines, the grim set of his mouth, and she saw his eyes, which were fixed on hers with an unnerving focus. "But tonight," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more commanding than any shout, "you're mine." The world tilted. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The statement was so audacious, so possessive. It was like a slap in the face. All her worst fears about him, about this place, coalesced into a single point of white-hot fury. How dare he? After she had made her position so clear, how dare he speak to her as if she were a horse he had won in a card game? She opened her mouth to deliver the most scathing retort she could summon, to lash him with the full force of her outrage. But he spoke again before she could, cutting her off, his voice still quiet and even. "Don't misunderstand me," he said, and for the first time, she detected a note of something almost like weariness in his tone. "I'm not talking about what you think I am." He gestured vaguely back toward the saloon. "In there, you stood up to Sully, and then I stood up to him. In this town, that's a public declaration. It means you're under my watch. He won't touch you. and neither will his friends, because they think you belong to me now. They think there's an arrangement. That's how it works here." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So you're right. You're not my kind of woman, and I'm not your kind of man, but that doesn't change the facts. I put my claim on this situation to keep you safe, whether you like it or not. For tonight, at least, the trouble that might have followed you out of that saloon is mine." Eliza stood frozen, the angry words dying on her lips. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he had said. He wasn't claiming her. He was claiming responsibility. He wasn't speaking of possession, but of consequences. He was explaining the crude, unwritten laws of this place, a social calculus that was as foreign to her as a dead language. In his world, protection wasn't a matter of chivalry, it was a matter of territory. By intervening, he had marked her as his, not as a lover, but as a liability he was now honor-bound to manage. The sheer, brutal pragmatism of it was staggering. It was both insulting and, in a strange, terrifying way, honorable. He had looked at the situation, understood its mechanics, and acted. He was now explaining those mechanics to her, not as a suitor, but as a seasoned strategist explaining the rules of the game to a novice. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. Everything she thought she knew about interactions between men and women was useless here. Her polite dismissals, her carefully constructed walls, they were like trying to build a dam of fine lace against a flash flood. He hadn't been trying to court her or intimidate her. He had been teaching her. I see," she finally managed to stammer, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if her understanding was all he required. "Go see Martha Blackwood," he said, his voice returning to its former, detached tone. "She's a good woman." Without another word, he turned and melted back into the shadows from which he had emerged. He didn't walk away so much as he was simply gone, his presence erased from the street, leaving Eliza alone with the echo of his words and the dizzying realization that she had just been handed a lesson in survival from the most unlikely of tutors. She stood there for a long time, the cool wind drying the flush on her cheeks. The clear, sharp lines she had tried to draw between them had been blurred. He had acknowledged their differences, even agreed with them, but he had also forged a connection between them, a bond of circumstance that she could not deny. He saw her strength, yet understood her vulnerability in this place better than she did herself. It was this contradiction, this clash between her world and his, that was so utterly compelling. It was not a meeting of like minds, but a collision of two vastly different realities. And in that collision, something new and dangerously intriguing had been sparked to life. The morning after her encounter with Caleb Thorne, Eliza rose with the first pale light of dawn. His words, a strange mix of pragmatism and command, had echoed in her thoughts through a restless night. She was not his kind of woman. He was not her kind of man. And yet, his advice was a solid, tangible thing in a world that had offered her nothing but suspicion. Clinging to that, she put on her plainest traveling dress, tied her hair back severely, and walked with a determined stride toward the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The Blackwood smithy was a cavern of fire and shadow, smelling of hot iron, coal smoke, and horse. A large, powerfully built man with a leather apron and arms thick with muscle was hammering a glowing horseshoe into shape. The rhythmic clang a deafening heartbeat in the morning air. A woman stood in the doorway of the small attached cottage, sweeping the porch. She was of middle age, with a weary but kind face and spectacles perched on her nose. Her movements were slow, her eyes squinting against the morning sun. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Eliza asked, her voice nearly lost in the noise from the forge. The woman stopped sweeping and peered at her. "I am. What can I do for you?" Her tone was not unkind, but it was wary. "My name is Eliza Reed. I was told you might have need of a seamstress." Martha Blackwood's gaze sharpened, taking in Eliza's appearance, the fine-boned features that spoke of a different life, and the resolute set of her jaw that spoke of the present. "Who told you that?" Eliza hesitated. To mention Caleb Thorne would be to publicly acknowledge the connection she had so fiercely denied. But to lie would be to start her new life on a false footing. "Mr. Thorne mentioned it," she said quietly. Martha's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She leaned her broom against the wall. "Caleb Thorne said that. Did he? He's not a man who wastes words." She studied Eliza for a moment longer. "Come inside." The cottage was small and cluttered but clean. A pile of rough, heavy clothing sat in a basket by the fire. It was a collection of tears, rips, and gaping holes. Denim trousers worn through at the knee, a canvas jacket with a sleeve half torn off, a wool shirt stained with something dark. This was not the delicate embroidery of her past. This was the brutal reality of men's work written in fabric. "This is the mending," Martha said simply. "Ranchers from the Bar T and the Double Creek bring it in. It's hard work on the hands, requires a strong needle and a stronger thread." She picked up a pair of trousers. "The denim is stiff as bark. Think you can handle it?" Eliza looked at the basket, then at her own hands, soft and pale beneath their gloves. She thought of Thorne's words. "They're not the hands of a woman who's ever been helpless." It was a challenge. She took off her gloves, folded them neatly, and picked up the torn jacket. She examined the rip, her mind already calculating the best stitch, the strongest way to reinforce the seam. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I can—" And so, her new life began. It was a life measured in spools of thread and the prick of a needle. She worked in a small chair by the window in Martha's cottage. The relentless clang of the forge, her daily companion. The first few days were agony. The thick, unforgiving fabric resisted the needle, and she had to use a thimble and a small pair of pliers to force it through. Her fingertips, accustomed to silk and lawn, were rubbed raw, then blistered, then bled. At night, in her small room at the boarding house, she would soak them in cool water, her entire body aching from the unfamiliar labor of bending over her work for 10 hours a day. But she did not stop. With each garment she mended, she was stitching herself into the fabric of Prosperity Creek. She learned to use a sailmaker's palm to drive the needle through thick canvas. She learned the subtle art of the patch, making it not just a repair, but a reinforcement. Her stitches were small, neat, and incredibly strong. Word of the new seamstress spread. Martha, pleased with the quality and speed of her work, began to give her more. Soon, women from the town began to arrive with their own mending, then with requests for new shirts or simple dresses. Eliza saved every penny. She ate the plain, repetitive meals at the boarding house and allowed herself no luxuries. She shed the last of her Eastern softness. Her movements became more economical, her speech more direct. The fancy traveling dress was packed away, replaced by a simple, practical skirt and blouse she sewed for herself from calico bought at the general store. The townspeople's stares, once filled with suspicion, slowly began to change. They were still watchful, but now their gaze held a grudging respect. She was no longer just the mysterious woman from the stagecoach. She was Miss Reed, the seamstress. She was a worker. In the West, that was a title of honor. She rarely saw Caleb Thorne. He was a phantom, a man who seemed to live on the vast, open range rather than in the confines of the town. But she felt his presence. She saw it in the faces of men like Sully, who now went out of their way to avoid her, their eyes averted. She heard it in snippets of conversation at the store. Talk of a cattle drive he was leading, or a pack of wolves he had tracked and dealt with for a homesteader. He was a constant, invisible thread in the tapestry of her new world. His life, she knew, was as hard as hers, but on a different scale. While she battled with needle and thread, he battled with the land itself. His work was a litany of dangers she could only imagine. One week, she saw him ride in with a herd of half-wild mustangs, his face grim with exhaustion, a long, raw rope burn on his neck. He and 2 other men spent 3 days in the corral outside of town. a whirlwind of dust, sweat, and controlled violence, gentling the horses. It was not a gentle process. It was a battle of wills between man and beast, a dangerous dance of patience and force, watching from a distance. Eliza saw in his methods the same focused, unyielding quality she had sensed in him that night on the street. He was not cruel, but he was relentless, meeting the horse's wild energy with his own unshakable calm until the animal finally surrendered. Another time, she overheard the blacksmith telling his wife that Thorne was out tracking for a homesteader whose only 2 oxen had wandered off in a storm. It was a job no one else wanted, a search through treacherous, rocky canyons with little hope of success. Thorne was gone for 4 days. The town buzzed with the assumption that the oxen were lost for good, likely taken by mountain lions. On the 5th day, he rode back into town, gaunt and caked in mud, driving the 2 lumbering beasts before him. He had found them trapped in a ravine miles away. He accepted the homesteader's meager payment, watered his horse, and disappeared again. His work done, their paths crossed only in fleeting moments. A nod from him as he rode past the smithy, his gray eyes meeting hers for a brief, unreadable instant. A time at the general store when they both reached for the same sack of flour, their hands brushing. The contact was like a spark of static electricity, and they both pulled back as if burned, murmuring apologies before retreating to their separate corners of the room. There were no words exchanged beyond these simple pleasantries, but a silent conversation was taking place. He saw the new calluses on her fingers as she paid for her goods. She saw the fresh cut on his cheek, or the weary slump of his shoulders after a long ride. They were like 2 solitary trees on the same wind-swept plain, their roots not touching, but their branches bent by the same harsh winds. They understood each other's exhaustion, each other's resilience, without needing to speak of it. Life in Prosperity Creek was a constant education in survival. The law was a distant concept, an abstract idea from the cities back east. Here, justice was swift and personal. Eliza saw it one afternoon when a drifter was caught trying to steal a horse from the livery. There was no trial. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Elias, held a court on the spot. The drifter was given back his saddle, a canteen of water, and told to start walking. He was warned that if he was ever seen in the county again, he'd be hanging from a cottonwood tree. It was brutal, but it was understood. A horse was a man's life, and to steal one was to sentence him to death. That was the law of the jungle. The ever-present tension with the native tribes was another fact of life. It was a low, constant hum of fear beneath the surface of daily routine. News would arrive via a traveling preacher or a supply wagon of a raid on a settlement 50 miles to the north, and a wave of anxiety would ripple through the town. Men would clean their rifles, and women would keep their children closer. Eliza saw the fear in Martha's eyes as she spoke of the family who had lived on their homestead before them. She never said what happened, but her silence was more eloquent than any words. It was a reminder that they were all living on borrowed land, their small flame of civilization a fragile thing in an ancient, untamed wilderness. In this crucible of hardship, an unspoken bond between Eliza and Caleb was being forged. It was not a bond of romance or courtship, but of mutual respect. It was built in the shared language of calloused hands and weary bones. She began to understand him, not as a man, but as a product of this harsh and beautiful land. His silence was not a lack of feeling, but a conservation of energy. His watchfulness was a survival skill. His integrity was as hard and unyielding as the rock of the canyons he rode through. One evening, as a fierce thunderstorm rolled in across the plains, trapping everyone indoors, Eliza was finishing a particularly difficult piece of mending on a heavy winter coat. As she worked by the light of a single lamp, listening to the rain lash against the windows, she found a small object in the pocket, a crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched. It was surprisingly detailed, the feathers etched with a careful hand. She knew, with a certainty that made her heart skip a beat, that the coat belonged to Caleb Thorne. She had seen him wearing it just last week. She held the small bird in the palm of her hand. It was a thing of unexpected grace and artistry, a secret piece of beauty created by a man she knew only as a figure of quiet strength and competence. It spoke of a hidden, inner life she could not have guessed at. It was a glimpse past the hardened exterior, a sign of the man who gentled horses and found lost oxen, the man who saw the strength in her hands. She carefully placed the bird back in the pocket and made her final, reinforcing stitch on the collar. As the thunder rattled the window panes, Eliza realized that the distance between their two worlds was shrinking. They were still different, a seamstress from Philadelphia and a cowboy from the plains. But the harsh realities of the frontier were a powerful solvent, dissolving old identities and forging new, unexpected connections in the heat of a shared struggle for survival. Prosperity Creek existed in a delicate, unspoken balance. It was a balance between the vast, indifferent power of the land and the stubborn, desperate tenacity of the people who clung to its surface. There was the power of the sun and the drought, the power of the winter blizzards, and the power of the sheer, crushing loneliness of the prairie. But there was another kind of power, a human one, that was beginning to cast a long, dark shadow over the small community. That power had a name: Silas Croft. Croft was not a resident of the town. He owned a massive ranch that spread for miles to the south, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass. He was a man who saw the world not in terms of people, but in terms of assets, land, cattle, and, most importantly, water. He had arrived in the territory a decade earlier with a fortune of unknown origin and had proceeded to buy, bully, and litigate his way into owning the best grazing lands in the county. His Bar C brand was on thousands of head of cattle, and his influence reached all the way to the territorial capital. For years, he had largely ignored the small homesteaders who scratched out a living on the quarter sections north of town, seeing them as little more than gnats. But the drought of the past 2 summers had changed that. The creeks on his own land were running low, and his gaze had turned north, to the clear, steady stream that gave Prosperity Creek its name and was the lifeblood for the half-dozen families farming the surrounding land. The trouble started subtly. A fence line moved a few yards overnight. A lone steer with the Bar C brand would be found trampling a homesteader's corn patch, and when the farmer tried to drive it off, 2 of Croft's riders would appear as if from nowhere, their hands resting on their pistols, suggesting it would be healthier to let the animal be. Eliza learned of this not through town gossip, which she still largely avoided, but through the fabric she mended. She could read the story of the growing conflict in the state of the clothes brought to her. Sarah Miller, a homesteader's wife with 2 young children and a perpetually worried expression, brought in her husband's only good shirt, torn from shoulder to elbow. "He was trying to repair our fence. Miss Reed," she explained, her voice a low, trembling whisper as she stood in the Blackwoods cottage. 2 of Mr. Croft's men rode by. They said the fence was on Bar C land now. When John argued, they helped him take it down. Eliza looked at the woman's chapped, work-worn hands, the deep lines of fear around her eyes, and she felt a cold anger stir within her. It was the same anger she had felt at the condescension of her family, the same fury at the injustice of a powerful man imposing his will on those with no means to fight back. Over the next few weeks, the stories grew worse. The Millers' small vegetable garden, painstakingly irrigated with buckets of water hauled from the creek, withered and died after the creek's flow was mysteriously reduced to a trickle. A dam, crude but effective, had been built upstream, diverting the bulk of the water onto Croft's land. When John Miller and 2 other homesteaders went to dismantle it, they were met by 4 armed riders who made it clear the dam was now considered Bar C property. Sheriff Elias was sympathetic, but useless. "Silas Croft has the best lawyers in the territory on his payroll," he told the farmers, his voice heavy with resignation. "He'll tie this up in court for years, claiming historic water rights. By the time it's sorted out, you'll all have starved or moved on. I can't do a thing unless they draw on you first, and they're too smart for that. The homesteaders were caught in a trap. They lacked the money for lawyers and the manpower to fight Croft's riders. A feeling of hopeless despair began to settle over them. It was this despair that brought Sarah Miller back to Eliza's chair by the window. This time not with mending, but with tears streaming down her face. "We'll lose everything, Miss Reed." She wept. "Everything John and I have worked for. Our children. What will we do?" Eliza put down her needle. She looked at Sarah. A good, hard-working woman being broken by a bully. And the old Eliza, the one who refused to be shamed, who refused to accept the dictates of an unjust authority, rose to the surface. She had no gun, no money, no influence, but she had a mind, an education, and a command of the English language that was a weapon in itself. "There is a territorial marshal," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is a federal officer. He is not beholden to men like Mr. Croft. We will write a letter. Sarah, a formal petition. You and the other families will sign it. We will state the facts clearly and calmly. We will describe the theft of your water and the threats made against you. We will demand an investigation." For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope appeared in Sarah Miller's eyes. The idea of a formal document, of appealing to a higher, more just authority, was a lifeline. For the next hour, Eliza put aside her mending. With paper and ink borrowed from Martha, she drafted the letter. She used precise, legalistic language, outlining the homesteaders' claims under the Land Ordinance Act and describing Silas Croft's actions as a clear infringement of their rights. Her handwriting was a model of clarity and elegance, a stark contrast to the rough world around her. That evening, Sarah and her husband took the document and got the signatures of the other 4 families. The next morning, they gave it to the stagecoach driver with a silver dollar to ensure it was delivered directly to the UAS, Marshal's office in the territorial capital. The act was done. It was a single stone thrown against a fortress wall, but it was an act of defiance, and it did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, Eliza was walking from the boarding house to the smithy. The morning was hot and still. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, 2 men moved to block her path. They had been lounging in front of the general store, but their casual posture was gone. They were tall and lean, with the cruel, empty eyes of men who enjoyed their work. She recognized them as the Dunn brothers, Jed and Marcus, Croft's most trusted enforcers. "Miss Reed, the taller one," Jed said, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. He removed his hat in a parody of politeness. "We hear you've been writing letters." Eliza's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She stopped, her small bag of sewing supplies clutched in her hand. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," said Marcus, the shorter, stockier brother. He stepped closer, invading her space. He smelled of sweat and chewing tobacco. Fancy words on fancy paper. "Stirring up trouble for Mr. Croft. He don't like trouble." The street, which had been bustling with its usual morning activity, grew quiet. People stopped what they were doing, watching from a safe distance. This was a direct challenge, a public display of power. "The homesteaders have a right to their water," Eliza said, her voice shaking slightly but holding its conviction. "Your employer has no right to steal it from them." Jed Dunn chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Rights, lady. The only right out here is what a man can take and hold, and Mr. Croft, he holds a lot. You're new here. You don't understand how things work. You should stick to your sewing and keep your nose out of business that ain't yours." "This is my business," Eliza retorted, her fear giving way to a flush of anger. "When people are being threatened and robbed, it is everyone's business." "Is that so?" Marcus took another step, so close now she could see the tobacco stains on his teeth. He reached out and, with a single finger, flicked the collar of her blouse. It was a gesture of profound contempt, a violation that was worse than a blow. "Maybe you need to be taught a lesson about minding your own affairs. A little lady like you." You could get hurt out here." Eliza stood frozen, trapped between the two of them. Her throat was dry. She knew she was in real danger. These men would not hesitate to harm her to make their point. She looked around for help, but the faces of the townspeople were impassive, closed off. No one would interfere. And then, a sound cut through the tense silence, the steady, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It hadn't stopped. It was a backdrop of normalcy against the unfolding threat. "She's not bothering anyone." "Jed." The voice came from the wide-open doorway of the smithy. Caleb Thorne stood there, wiping his hands on an oily rag. He wasn't wearing a gun belt, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was a weapon. He had emerged from the forge so quietly that no one had noticed him. He didn't move forward or raise his voice. He just stood there, his gray eyes as cold and hard as iron, fixed on the Dunn brothers. Jed turned his head slowly. His mocking smile vanished, replaced by a sullen scowl. "Stay out of this, Thorne. This is Croft's business." "She's on her way to work," Caleb replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Right here, on Blackwood's property. That makes it my business. Now, back away from her." For a long, charged moment, no one moved. It was 3 men and a woman on a dusty street, but the fate of the town's fragile balance seemed to hang on the outcome. The Dunn brothers were armed. Thorne was not, but the Dunns knew his reputation. They knew that facing an unarmed Caleb Thorne was still a very poor gamble. Marcus Dunn looked at his brother, a silent question in his eyes. Jed's gaze flickered from Thorne's unblinking stare back to Eliza's pale but defiant face. He was weighing the risks. Humiliating a lone woman was one thing. Forcing a confrontation with Caleb Thorne was another matter entirely, one that Silas Croft would not thank him for if it went wrong. Caleb took one slow, deliberate step out of the doorway. He didn't move toward the brothers. He moved to the side, positioning himself slightly behind Eliza, not as a shield, but as a buttress. He was a wall at her back, a silent statement that they would have to go through him. He did not look at them anymore. He looked at Eliza. His eyes held hers, and in them, she saw no pity, no condescension. She saw a calm, clear expectation. He had created a standoff, a moment of equilibrium, but he was not going to fight her battle for her. He had given her the ground. It was up to her to hold it. "Tell them to leave, Miss Reed," he said, his voice so low it was meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of an order. His words were like a splash of cold water. He was giving the power, the final word, back to her. He had intervened not to save her, but to allow her to save herself. His belief in her ability to do so was a tangible thing, a force that pushed the fear from her heart and replaced it with a surge of strength. Eliza turned her full attention back to the 2 men in front of her. She drew herself up to her full, modest height. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. "You have said what you came to say," she stated, her tone as cold and sharp as a new needle. "Now leave. I have work to do." Jed Dunn's face darkened with fury. To be dismissed so completely, by a woman, in front of the whole town, was a deep insult. He took a half-step forward, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip. Before he could complete the movement, Caleb shifted his weight. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, but it was filled with a lethal promise. Jed's eyes darted to him, and he saw the absolute certainty on Thorne's face. He froze. "Finally, with a vile curse!" He spat on the boardwalk near Eliza's feet. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." He and his brother turned and stalked back down the street, their anger a palpable force. The town seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The show was over. The immediate crisis had passed. Eliza's knees felt weak, but she refused to let them buckle. She stood perfectly still, watching them go. "They're gone," Caleb said quietly from behind her. She turned to face him. His gray eyes were studying her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He gave a slight shake of his head, dismissing her thanks. "That letter of yours, it was a brave thing to do. A foolish thing, but brave." He looked down the street where the Dunns had disappeared. "Words are good, but out here, you better know what comes after, for when words aren't enough, Croft won't forget this." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the new, dangerous line she had drawn in the sand. Then, he turned without another word and went back into the fiery darkness of the forge, the steady, rhythmic clang of his hammer resuming its beat, a sound that was no longer just the town's heartbeat, but a symbol of the quiet, unyielding strength she was just beginning to understand. The calm that followed Eliza's public defiance of the Dunn brothers was thin and fragile, like a sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Silas Croft was not a man to accept such a public rebuke. The air in Prosperity Creek grew thick with anticipation. Men walked with their hands closer to their hips, and women hurried through their errands, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows between buildings. The homesteaders, emboldened by Eliza's letter but terrified of the consequences, began to carry rifles with them to their fields. The town was holding its breath. Caleb Thorne seemed to be the only person unaffected. He continued his work with the same quiet, relentless focus as always. He shod horses, mended wagon wheels, and rode out on errands that took him deep into the disputed territory north of the creek, his movements a silent challenge to Croft's authority. Eliza found herself watching for his return each evening, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach until she saw his familiar, lean figure ride back into town, safe for another day. She told herself it was because his presence kept the peace, but she knew, in a place deep within her she did not want to examine, that it was more personal than that. The breaking point came on a blistering hot afternoon a week after the confrontation. A lone rider, one of the homesteaders named Peterson, galloped into town, his face pale with panic, his horse lathered and heaving. He half fell from the saddle and staggered toward the smithy. "It's Thorne," he gasped, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "They ambushed him, by the old cottonwoods near the creek. 4 of them. I heard the shots and saw him go down." The words struck the town like a physical blow. "Mister?" Blackwood dropped his hammer, its clang echoing the sudden, shocking silence. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store. Sheriff Elias came running from his office, buckling his gun belt. Eliza, who had been organizing a new shipment of thread in the cottage, felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands grew cold, and the small room seemed to tilt. She rushed to the doorway, her heart pounding a sickening rhythm against her ribs. "How bad is he?" the sheriff demanded. "Don't know," Peterson stammered. "I saw him fall from his horse. They rode off when they saw me coming. I didn't dare go closer alone. They're Croft's men. The Dunns were with them." A posse was formed in minutes. A half-dozen men, including Mr. Blackwood and a grim-faced Sheriff Elias, mounted up and thundered out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and a terrified silence in their wake. Martha Blackwood began to weep quietly, her face buried in her apron. Eliza stood rooted to the spot, her mind a maelstrom of fear. She pictured Caleb lying alone by the creek, his quiet strength bleeding out into the dust. The image was so vivid, so unbearable, that she had to grip the door frame to keep from fainting. The wait was an eternity. Every tick of the clock in the cottage was a torment. Eliza tried to sew, but her hands trembled so violently she could not guide the needle. She made coffee. She swept the floor. She did anything to keep from thinking, but the image of him falling, of his stillness, was burned into her mind. An hour later, they returned. They came not with the grim slowness of a party bearing a body, but with a tense urgency. Caleb was alive. He was slumped over his own horse, held in the saddle by Mr. Blackwood riding alongside him. His face was a mask of dirt and blood. His hat was gone, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. They brought him directly to the smithy and carried him into the small cottage, laying him gently on the narrow bed that Martha used for naps. The room was suddenly crowded, filled with the smell of sweat, dust, and the sharp, coppery scent of blood. "Give him some air," the sheriff commanded, shooing the curious onlookers out the door. Eliza pushed her way to the bedside. He was unconscious. A long, bloody gash ran across his temple, matting his dark hair. His shirt was soaked with blood from a wound high on his right side, just below the ribs. His breathing was shallow, his face a ghastly, waxy pale beneath the grime. He looked breakable. The formidable, unshakable man she knew had vanished, replaced by this fragile, broken stranger. "His shoulder's dislocated, Mister," Blackwood said, his voice grim. "And he's been shot. The bullet went clean through, looks like, but he lost a lot of blood, and that knock on the head." Martha took one look at the blood and turned away, her face green. I can't," she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I'll get Doc Adams," the sheriff said, "but he was already 3 sheets to the wind an hour ago. Might not be much use." He turned and left. They were alone, Eliza, the blacksmith, his nauseated wife, and the unconscious man on the bed. "Mister." Blackwood looked from his wife to Eliza, his expression one of helpless appeal. "Miss Reed, I've got to get this shoulder back in place before it starts to swell bad, but I'll need help. I need someone to clean these wounds." Eliza didn't hesitate. The sight of Caleb's blood, which would have horrified the Philadelphia lady she once was, now filled her with a fierce, protective resolve. All her fear coalesced into a single, sharp point of purpose. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice a command. She moved with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She sent Martha for the whiskey bottle and all the clean rags she could find. She put a kettle on the stove to boil water. She found a sharp knife and held it in the fire until it glowed, sterilizing it. Her mind was clear, her hands steady. This was just another, more terrible, kind of mending. Mr. Blackwood, seeing her competence, nodded in relief. "First, the shoulder." He cut away the sleeve of Caleb's bloody shirt, revealing a taut, muscled arm and a shoulder that was grotesquely out of place. "I'm going to have to pull hard. I need you to hold him down. Keep him from moving." Eliza braced herself, placing her hands firmly on Caleb's uninjured shoulder and hip. "As Mr. Blackwood took hold of the dislocated arm and began to pull. A low groan escaped Caleb's lips. His body tensed, a reflexive arch of pure agony. Eliza leaned her weight onto him, her own muscles straining, whispering words of reassurance he could not hear. "It's all right. Hold still. It's all right." There was a sickening, wet pop as the joint slid back into place. Caleb cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain that tore through the quiet room. And then his body went limp, his head lolling to the side. "It's done," the blacksmith said, his face beaded with sweat. "Now, the wounds." He left to tend to the horses, leaving Eliza alone with Caleb. She worked methodically, her revulsion overcome by a deep, primal need to care for him. She cut away the rest of his shirt, exposing his torso. It was lean and hard, a landscape of old scars that told the story of a difficult life. A long, thin white line across his ribs, a puckered circle on his thigh, each a silent testament to past violence. With warm water and a clean cloth, she began to gently wash the blood and grime from his skin. The bullet wound in his side was a ragged tear, but as Mr. Blackwood had said, it had passed through. She cleaned it as best she could, her touch light and careful. Then she turned to the gash on his head. The blood had clotted in his hair, and she had to cut some of it away to clean the wound properly. As she worked, her fingers brushing against his skin, she felt the fever radiating from him. He began to mutter, his head tossing back and forth on the pillow. The words were slurred, disconnected, a name. Lucas, spoken with a kind of desperate sorrow. Then, phrases the river. Too fast. My fault. Fragments of a nightmare she could not understand. He was adrift, lost in some dark memory of his past, and in that delirium, the walls he kept so carefully around himself crumbled. She saw not the stoic cowboy, but a man haunted by grief and guilt. She finished cleaning the wounds and poured a little whiskey over them as a disinfectant. He flinched at the sting, his eyes fluttering open for a brief second. They were clouded with fever, unfocused, and they looked right through her. Then they closed again. She bandaged the wounds tightly with strips of clean linen, her stitches neat and practical, a seamstress's skill applied to human flesh. When she was done, she pulled a chair to the bedside. Mr. Blackwood returned, looked at her work, and nodded his approval. You've got a surgeon's touch. Miss Reed. Doc Adams couldn't have done better. He placed a Colt revolver on the small table beside her. I've got to get back to the forge. You holler if he wakes up, The sun began to set, filling the small cottage with a soft, orange light. Martha brought her a bowl of soup, which she barely touched. She sat and watched him breathe, the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. The silence of the room was profound. She studied his face in the fading light, the hard lines softened by unconsciousness, the dark lashes against his pale skin. She saw the vulnerability he always kept so carefully hidden. This man, who had faced down drunkards and armed enforcers without flinching, was now completely helpless, his life held in a fragile balance. The distance between their two worlds, the one she had come from and the one he inhabited, had never seemed so vast, and yet she had never felt closer to him. In this moment, she was not an outsider, a lady playing at being a seamstress, and he was not a mysterious, intimidating cowboy. They were just two people in a small, quiet room, bound together by an act of violence and an act of care. Her carefully constructed defenses, her pride, her fierce independence, they all melted away in a wave of overwhelming compassion. His fever climbed as night fell. He grew more restless, his muttering more agitated. She bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth, trying to soothe him, speaking to him in a low, soft voice. She told him he was safe, that he was not alone. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she couldn't bear the thought of him facing his demons by himself. Sometime after midnight, his shivering started, violent, uncontrollable tremors that shook the bed. His teeth chattered, and a low moan of misery escaped his lips. The crisis had come. She piled every blanket Martha had onto him, but it did no good. He was freezing from the inside out. In desperation, she did the only thing she could think of. She lay down on the narrow bed beside him, outside the blankets, and wrapped her arms around him, trying to warm his shaking body with her own. It was the most scandalous, improper thing she had ever done. The intimate contact, the feeling of his hard, trembling body against hers, would have been unthinkable just a day before. But in the dim lamplight of the cottage, with the specter of death in the room, the rules of her old world seemed absurd and meaningless. All that mattered was the warmth of her body against his, the fight for his life. She held him like that for what felt like hours, her own body growing stiff and cold, until finally, slowly, the shivering began to subside. The violent tremors lessened, then stopped. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. The fever had broken. He sank into a deep, healing sleep, his head turned toward her on the pillow. Eliza lay there, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, her own heart slowly returning to its normal rhythm. She had seen behind his armor. She had touched his weakness, listened to his nightmares, and felt the fragile beat of his life against her own. The wall between them, the one built of their differences, of her pride and his silence, had been washed away in a tide of blood and fever. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing between them would ever be the same again. Caleb Thorne woke to the unfamiliar sensation of softness. The bed beneath him was not his own hard-tacked bunk, and the air, thick with the scent of dried herbs and antiseptic, was not the clean, sharp air of the plains. A dull, throbbing ache pulsed behind his eyes, and a sharper, more insistent fire burned in his side. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and a firm, gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder pressed him back down. "You'll do yourself more harm if you move," a quiet voice said. His vision cleared, and he focused on the face above him. Eliza Reed. Her features were drawn with exhaustion. Dark circles smudged beneath her eyes, but her expression was one of calm, resolute authority. She was holding a spoon with some kind of broth, the steam rising in the dim light of the cottage. He was in the Blackwoods place. Memory returned in a disorienting flood, the ambush by the creek, the searing pain, the fall into darkness. How long he rasped, his throat dry and raw. "A day and a night," she answered, not missing a beat. "You had a fever. It broke this morning. Now, drink this." She held the spoon to his lips. His first instinct, a primal urge for self-sufficiency, was to turn his head, to refuse the help, to deny the weakness, but he was too tired to argue, and the savory smell of the broth was a powerful persuasion. He allowed her to feed him. The simple act of being cared for so foreign it felt like a violation. With each spoonful, a little strength returned, and with that strength came a sharp, uncomfortable awareness of his own vulnerability. She had seen him like this. She had tended to his wounds, cleaned his blood, and seen him at his absolute lowest. He remembered fragments from the fever dream, disjointed images of a rushing river and a boy's face, a memory he had buried for a decade. He wasn't sure what he had said, what secrets he had betrayed in his delirium, and the not knowing was a torment. He felt exposed, stripped of the silent, formidable armor he had worn for years. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice a low grumble. "Martha could have managed." "Mrs. Blackwood has a weak stomach for blood," Eliza stated simply, setting the empty bowl aside. "And you needed watching. Someone had to do it." Her tone was matter-of-fact, betraying none of the turmoil or intimacy of the long night she had spent by his side. But Caleb saw the slight tremor in her hands as she refolded a bandage. He saw a new weariness in her that hadn't been there before. He had not just been a patient, he had been a burden, and Caleb Thorne was never a burden. The thought chafed him raw. He owed her a debt now, a personal one, and the weight of it was heavier than any physical wound. Over the next few days, a new, fragile routine was established. Eliza arrived at the cottage at dawn and left after dusk. She changed his bandages, fed him, and read aloud from a worn copy of Shakespeare that Martha owned, her voice a low, steady murmur that was more soothing than any doctor's tonic. She was a constant, quiet presence. They spoke little. The charged space between them was filled with 1,000 unsaid things. He was gruffly resistant. She was implacably patient. He would try to get up, and she would be there, a firm hand guiding him back to the pillows, her touch sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with his injuries. While this quiet battle of wills was being waged in the sick room, a noisier war was being fought in the court of public opinion. Prosperity Creek had a long memory and a short supply of charity. The story of the ambush was quickly overshadowed by a more tantalizing tale, the Eastern Lady. The seamstress, with the mysterious past, had spent the night unchaperoned with the wounded Caleb Thorne. The spark of gossip, lit by a few choice whispers, was fanned into a flame by the town's inherent suspicion of an outsider. The grudging respect Eliza had so painstakingly earned with her needle and thread began to unravel. When she went to the general store for supplies, the friendly chatter would cease the moment she walked through the door. Women who had previously praised her mending work now offered only tight, thin smiles and turned their backs to whisper to one another. The looks she received were no longer curious, but cold and condemning. They saw not a woman who had saved a man's life, but a shameless opportunist who had used his moment of weakness to compromise him. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, was the first to give voice to the poison. She cornered Eliza one evening as she returned, weary to her bones, from the cottage. "People are talking, Miss Reed," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of righteous satisfaction. "Talking a great deal. It isn't proper, what you're doing, spending all hours of the day and night with that man. A woman's reputation is a delicate thing, especially a woman, without family to speak for her." The implication was clear. Eliza's past, her solitary state, made her guilty before she was ever tried. They had been waiting for her to confirm their worst assumptions, and this was all the proof they needed. "I am nursing a wounded man, Mrs. Gable," Eliza replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "An act of Christian charity. Some are calling it by a different name, Mrs." Gable sniffed, her eyes full of malicious glee. "They're saying you've trapped him, that a man like Caleb Thorne, an honorable man, has had his good name tangled up with yours. It's a shame. It is. He's losing respect in this town on account of you." Eliza walked away, her back ramrod straight. But the woman's words were like barbs in her flesh. It wasn't just her own reputation at stake, but his. The thought that her actions, born of compassion, were now harming the very man she had tried to save was a bitter pill to swallow. She had brought the taint of her own past into his life, and the town was punishing them both for it. The whispers reached Caleb as well. Mr. Blackwood, a decent man but a poor liar, would shift his feet and avoid Caleb's gaze when he brought him his meals. Even Sheriff Elias, stopping by to check on his recovery, seemed uncomfortable. "You're healing up fine." "Caleb," he said, looking at the ceiling. "Just be mindful is all. This town's got a mean streak for gossip, and folks are worried about you. Don't want to see you get entangled." Caleb's jaw tightened. Entangled. He looked at the fresh bandages on his side, applied that morning by Eliza's steady, capable hands. He thought of her quiet presence, the way she never complained, the way she had met the Dunn brothers' threats with a courage he'd rarely seen in men. And he thought of the town, of their petty, vicious minds, twisting an act of mercy into something sordid. A cold, unfamiliar rage began to simmer within him. He had spent his life avoiding complications, and now he found himself at the very center of one, not of his own making. And the injustice of it, the sheer unfairness of her being punished for helping him, was something his simple, stark code of honor could not abide. The breaking point came a week after the ambush. Caleb was finally strong enough to sit in a chair by the window, though every movement was a painful effort. Eliza had just finished changing his dressing. The silence between them was heavier than usual. She seemed more distant, her movements efficient but lacking their previous warmth. He could see the strain on her face, the way she held her shoulders as if expecting a blow. She folded the last of the linens and placed them in a basket. She did not look at him. "You are much stronger now, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice formal, devoid of emotion. "Mr. Blackwood is capable of helping you from here on. There is no longer any need for me to impose." Caleb stared at her. "Impose?" "My presence here is causing talk," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were filled with a mixture of hurt and fierce, wounded pride. "It is damaging your standing in this community. I will not be the cause of that. It is best if I keep my distance." She was offering him an escape. She was cutting the cord of obligation, allowing him to retreat back into his solitary, uncomplicated life. And in doing so, she was accepting the town's judgment and preparing to bear it alone. He saw the sacrifice she was making, the lonely, difficult path she was choosing in order to protect him. He looked out the window at the dusty street, at the town that was so quick to judge and so slow to understand. He could take her offer. He could nod, thank her for her help, and let her walk out the door. The gossip would die down. His life would return to its simple, quiet rhythm. He would be free. But he knew it would be a hollow freedom. It would be a freedom bought at the cost of his own integrity, a freedom that would feel, forever after, like cowardice. He had spent his life living by a simple code: you meet your obligations. You protect those who are weaker, and you never, ever back down from a fight that is just. The town had made her their target because of him. This was now his fight as much as it was hers. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his side and the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. He stood before her, unsteady but resolute. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. Eliza looked at him, startled. "No, you're not going anywhere." He said, "It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. You will continue to come here until I am on my feet. And when I am on my feet, I will walk you to and from the boarding house every day." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Mr. Thorne, that will only make things worse. It will confirm every rumor." "Let it," he said, his gray eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. "Let them talk. Let them look. Their words are just wind. We will show them they have no power over us." He was choosing her. He was choosing to stand with the outsider against the community that had, until now, respected him. He was choosing to become an outsider himself, for her. It was the most profound declaration he could possibly make, spoken not in the language of affection, but in the language of a shared battle. He saw the shock in her eyes give way to a dawning, incredulous hope. The armor of her pride began to crack. Why, she whispered, the question barely audible, "Why would you do that?" For the first time, Caleb Thorne looked away, a flicker of that same deep vulnerability she had seen in his fever returning. "When I was out, in the fever, I talked, didn't I?" She nodded slowly. "You spoke of someone named Lucas, and a river." A shadow passed over his face, a deep and ancient pain. "Lucas was my younger brother," he said, the words rough, as if pulled from a great depth. "He drowned when we were boys. I was supposed to be watching him." The confession hung in the air between them, a piece of his broken soul offered up to her. It was an act of ultimate trust, a sharing of the secret guilt that had shaped the silent, solitary man he had become. He was giving her a weapon that could destroy him, and in doing so, he was showing her he knew she would never use it. He had answered her question. He was doing this because she had been there in his darkest hour, had listened to his ghosts, and had not turned away. In that moment, she understood. Their bond was no longer about a debt or an obligation. It was forged in a shared vulnerability, a trust that ran deeper than any rumor. "The broth is getting cold," she said, her voice thick with emotion she could not yet name. She picked up the bowl, her hands no longer shaking. "You should eat." It was an acceptance, a quiet agreement. They were no longer two separate people struggling for survival. They were a single, defiant unit. The town had drawn its line in the sand, and Caleb and Eliza had just made their choice to stand together on the other side of it, true to his word. Caleb Thorne became Eliza's shadow. In the 2 weeks it took for the last of his strength to return, he was a constant, silent presence at her side. Every morning, he would be waiting outside the boarding house, his face set in a grim, unyielding expression. The Colt revolver now a permanent fixture on his hip. He would walk with her to the smithy, his stride slow and deliberate to match hers, his broad shoulders a shield against the hostile stares and whispered insults that followed them down the street. Every evening, he would be there to escort her back. Their walks were silent affairs. The air between them was charged with the things they did not say. The town, in turn, treated them like ghosts, parting before them on the boardwalk. Their conversations ceasing, their faces a mixture of fear, disapproval, and a grudging, resentful curiosity. Eliza and Caleb were an island, a defiant nation of two against the world. He had chosen his side, and in doing so, had forced the town to choose theirs. most out of fear of Silas Croft or a simple adherence to convention, chose to stand against them. The annual harvest dance was meant to be a truce, a rare night when the entire county could set aside its hardships, its feuds, and its fears. It was held in the largest barn on the outskirts of town, a cavernous space scrubbed clean and hung with dozens of lanterns that cast a warm, flickering glow. The rough-hewn floor had been swept and sprinkled with sawdust, and a makeshift stage at one end held a trio of musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and a man with a guitar who filled the air with lively, foot-stomping tunes. Tables along the walls groaned with food brought by the townsfolk: roasted chickens, fresh-baked bread, pies of every description. For one night, Prosperity Creek pretended to be a place of joy and community. When Caleb Thorne and Eliza Reed walked through the wide barn doors, the truce was broken. The music faltered for a beat. The swirl of dancers in the center of the floor slowed. A wave of silence radiated out from the entrance, quieting the laughter and conversation. Every head turned. Caleb stood tall, his recovering injuries causing a slight stiffness in his posture that only made him look more formidable. He wore clean denim and a dark shirt, his presence a stark, imposing reality against the festive backdrop. Beside him, Eliza felt 100 pairs of eyes land on her like a physical weight. For this occasion, she had allowed herself a small indulgence. She wore a simple dress of deep green calico she had sewn herself. It was modest and unadorned, but it fit her perfectly, the color bringing out the auburn glints in her tightly coiled hair. She held her head high, her expression calm, her gloved hands clasped before her. She would not let them see her fear. Caleb offered her his arm, a formal, courtly gesture that was so out of character for him it was a deliberate act of defiance. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they walked into the room. The crowd parted before them. A sea of hostile and suspicious faces. The whispers started, a sibilant hiss that followed them like the rustle of a snake through dry grass. Shameless. Look at her. Has him wrapped around her finger. They found a small, unoccupied space near the back wall, far from the main throng. Caleb did not speak, but stood beside her, his gaze sweeping the room, his stillness a warning. No one approached them. They were utterly, completely alone in a room full of people. The musicians, after a nervous glance at one another, struck up a new tune, and the dancing resumed. But the easy joy had gone out of the evening. Their presence had soured it. An hour later, Silas Croft arrived. He did not enter. He made an entrance, flanked by the Dunn brothers and 3 other Bar C riders. He strode into the barn as if he owned it. He was a large, imposing man in his 50s, with a florid face, a thick neck, and pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. He was dressed in an expensive tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place, a clear statement of his wealth and superiority. He clapped his hands together, his voice booming over the music. Evening, friends, neighbors. The music trailed off into silence. Every eye turned to him. Don't let me stop the festivities. In fact, I'm here to add to them. Bar keep a round of whiskey for every man here, and lemonade for the ladies. Put it on my account. A hesitant cheer went up from some of the men. Croft smiled, a predator's thin-lipped display of satisfaction. He was the lord of the manor, bestowing his largesse upon his humble subjects. His gaze swept the room, and then it landed, as he knew it would, on the 2 figures standing alone in the corner. His smile widened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He began to walk toward them, the Dunn brothers trailing in his wake like vultures. The crowd shifted, clearing a path, their faces alive with a cruel, eager anticipation. The main event was about to begin. Croft stopped a few feet from them. He ignored Eliza completely, his eyes fixed on Caleb. He shook his head in a pantomime of sorrowful disappointment. Caleb, 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 he said, his voice dripping with false concern. It pains me to see you like this, wounded and keeping such curious company. There was a time when your name meant something in this county, a time when you were a man to be respected. Now look at you." Caleb's face was a mask of stone. His only reaction was the slight tensing of the muscles along his jaw. "I'm doing just fine. Croft," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Are you?" Croft let out a short, derisive laugh. "Hiding in the shadows with this seamstress from the East, a woman of uncertain history who arrives with fine clothes and no family, a woman who attaches herself to a good, simple man the moment he's wounded and helpless." He finally turned his cold eyes on Eliza, his gaze raking over her with deliberate, insulting slowness. "Tell me, Miss Reed, what is your price? Surely a man like Caleb Thorne, a man of property and standing, was a prize worth scheming for." The insult was a splash of filth in the warm, festive air. Eliza felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of shame and fury. Beside her, she felt Caleb shift his weight, his body coiling with a silent, lethal tension. "That's enough, Croft," Caleb said, his voice dropping to the deadly calm register he had used on Sully in the saloon. He took a half-step forward, placing himself partially in front of Eliza. The crowd gasped. Everyone knew what that tone meant. Everyone expected the glint of fire and the roar of a gunshot. But before Caleb could take another step, a small, gloved hand rested on his forearm. It was Eliza. Her touch was light, but it held him in place more effectively than any chain. He turned his head slightly to look at her, a question in his eyes. She gave him a look of profound, unwavering resolve, a silent message that this was her fight to wage. She let go of his arm and stepped forward. Out from behind his protective shadow, she stood before Silas Croft, a small, slender figure in green calico, her chin held high, her gaze direct and unflinching. The barn was so quiet one could hear the hiss of the lanterns. "Mr. Thorne does not need you to defend his honor. Mr. Croft," she began, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the silent room, "and I do not need him to defend mine." She paused, letting her words settle. She looked away from Croft and let her gaze travel over the faces of the townspeople, the women who had whispered behind her back, the men who had looked at her with suspicion. She was speaking to all of them now. "It is true," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned her listeners into stillness. "I came to your town alone, with a past I do not speak of, not because I am ashamed of it, but because it is mine. It does not belong to you, and it does not define me here." She turned her eyes back to Croft. "You speak of my reputation. You wonder what kind of woman I am. Let me tell you, my reputation is not found in the whispers in your saloon or the gossip in your general store. My reputation is in the work of my hands." She pointed a finger, not at Croft, but toward the crowd. "It is in the coat on your back, Mr. Miller, the one your wife thought was ruined beyond repair. It is in the wedding dress Sarah Peterson wears tonight, sewn from her own mother's, a dress she wept with joy to see made new. It is in the dozens of shirts and trousers and blankets in this room, mended not with fancy words, but with a strong needle and a tireless hand. That is my reputation. My worth is not in who my father was, or how much money I possess. It is in the strength of my stitches and the honesty of my labor." A murmur went through the crowd. Men looked down at their mended clothes. Women exchanged uncertain glances. She had taken their private, domestic world and held it up as a banner of honor, a truth more powerful than Croft's public accusations. "You, Mr. Croft," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You measure a person's value in acres of land and head of cattle. You believe your power comes from the fear you inspire and the men you pay to enforce your will. But that is not power. It is a hollow imitation of it. True strength is found in people like the Millers and the Petersons, who work the land with their own hands, who face drought and hardship with courage, and who ask for nothing but a fair chance. It is the strength of a man like Mr. Thorne, who helps his neighbors not for profit, but because it is the right thing to do. She took a final step closer to Croft, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire he could not meet. So, yes, I am a woman who is not your kind. I am a woman who was taught that her only value was in a respectable marriage, but who has learned that her true value is in her own self-respect. I am a woman who earns her own way, speaks her own mind, and chooses her own company. And I assure you, I require no man's approval, least of all yours to do so. She finished. The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing, profound vacuum. She had not raised her voice, had not shed a tear. She had simply spoken the truth, and her words had disarmed him more completely than any bullet could have. She had taken his insults and reforged them into a shield of integrity. Silas Croft stood there, his face a mottled, ugly red. He had been publicly defeated, his authority challenged and his character exposed, not by a gunslinger, but by a seamstress. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a man whose power was built on bluster and intimidation, and faced with a strength he could not comprehend, he was rendered impotent. With a strangled curse, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the barn, his hired guns trailing behind him like whipped dogs. The tension in the room broke. Someone let out a long, shaky breath. The fiddler, after a moment, tentatively drew his bow across the strings, and a soft, hesitant melody filled the void. Eliza felt the strength drain out of her, leaving her trembling. Then, a hand was on her elbow, steady and sure. It was Caleb. He was looking down at her, and his face, usually so guarded and impassive, was filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen there before. It was not pity or gratitude. It was awe. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In his eyes, she saw not a woman he had rescued, but an equal he was proud to stand beside. The chasm between their two worlds had finally, irrevocably, closed. The dawn that followed the harvest dance broke quiet and unnervingly still. The festive lanterns had been taken down, and the barn once again smelled of hay and animals, as if the night of music and defiance had been nothing but a dream. But it was not a dream. The truth of it hung in the air, a palpable tension that was thicker than the morning mist rising from the creek. Every citizen of Prosperity Creek knew that Silas Croft's public humiliation was a debt that would be collected in a currency other than words. Eliza felt it as she walked to the smithy. The few people she passed on the street no longer looked at her with condemnation, but with a new, more unsettling emotion, fear. Her victory had not made them allies. It had simply made them aware that they were standing in the shadow of a falling mountain. Caleb was waiting for her, as he always was. He stood by the forge, his face grim, checking the action on a Winchester rifle. The easy, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was absent. Today, the only sounds were the nervous whinny of a horse and the dry whisper of the wind. "He won't let it be," Caleb said without preamble, his eyes scanning the empty plains to the south. It wasn't a question. "I know," Eliza replied, her hands clutching the small bag that held her sewing. The familiar tools felt flimsy and useless now. "It will come today," he continued, his voice flat. "He can't wait. To wait would be to show weakness. He'll want to wipe the memory of last night off the map." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "You should have left on the morning stage." "And gone where?" she asked, a touch of her old fire returning. "There is nowhere to run where men like him do not exist. My running days are over. I will not be driven out." A flicker of something pride, respect, a deep and painful sorrow for what was to come passed across his face. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right, then." He handed a freshly cleaned Colt revolver to Mr. Blackwood, who accepted it with a hand that trembled slightly. "John Miller and the others are posted at the north end of town, by the livery. If Croft comes, he'll come in force, down the main street. He'll want to make a show of it." The waiting was its own kind of torture. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the dusty street, baking the silence into the very air. Businesses did not open. Doors remained shut and barred. Prosperity Creek had become a ghost town, inhabited only by the ghosts of what was to come. Eliza found she could not sit still. She made a fresh pot of coffee, her hands moving with a purpose she did not feel. She was terrified. A cold, hard knot of fear lodged deep in her belly, but woven through the fear was a strange, unyielding calm. She had made her stand. She would not regret it, no matter the cost. It was just past noon when they came. They appeared first as a dark, rising cloud on the southern horizon, a cloud of dust. Then the sound came, a low, continuous rumble like distant thunder. It grew steadily louder, resolving into the drumming of 100 hooves. They rode not as a posse, but as an army. At least 20 riders, with Silas Croft and the Dunn brothers at their head. They rode shoulder to shoulder, a wave of grim-faced men armed with rifles and a righteous fury. Their purpose to crush the small, defiant town that had dared to laugh at their master. Inside, Caleb commanded, his voice cutting through the frightened paralysis that had gripped them. He pushed Eliza and the Blackwoods into the smithy, then slid the heavy barn door almost shut, leaving only a narrow slit to see through. "Stay down, and stay away from the walls." The thunder grew deafening. The riders swept into the single street, their war cries a terrifying chorus. The first shots rang out, not aimed at anyone in particular, but fired into the air, into windows, into the sign of the general store. It was an act of pure, violent intimidation. A barrel of water on the boardwalk was blasted apart, its staves flying, its precious contents gushing into the dust. Then the return fire began. A single rifle cracked from the second-story window of the saloon, where Sheriff Elias had taken his post. Another shot answered from the livery stable. The battle for Prosperity Creek had begun. The smithy was a fortress of brick and thick timber. The air inside was dark and suffocatingly hot, smelling of coal smoke and fear. Through the crack in the door, Eliza could see the chaotic scene unfolding. Men on horseback galloped up and down the street, firing indiscriminately. The air filled with a haze of gunpowder smoke and dust. A choking, sulphurous fog through which dark shapes moved like demons in a nightmare. Caleb stood by the door, the Winchester steady in his hands. He was not firing wildly. He was waiting, his eyes narrowed, his movements economical. He was a hunter. He fired once. A rider cried out and clutched his arm, his horse shying and bolting. Caleb worked the lever on the rifle, ejecting the spent shell, his face a mask of cold concentration. "We need more guns loaded," he said, not taking his eyes off the street. "Mr." Blackwood was frozen, his face pale, the revolver hanging uselessly in his hand. But Martha, her face grim, went to a heavy wooden chest and pulled out an old, double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. She handed them to Eliza. "My father taught me how to load one of these," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "But I can't bring myself to fire it." The shotgun was impossibly heavy in Eliza's hands. It was a brutal, ugly piece of machinery, its purpose single-minded and terrible. Her entire life, she had been taught to abhor violence, to be a creature of grace and gentility. But grace and gentility had no place here. She looked at Caleb, his body tense, his recently healed side surely screaming in protest as he aimed and fired again. She looked at the terror on the Blackwoods' faces. She thought of the Millers, fighting for their small patch of land. This was her town now. These were her people, and they were being slaughtered. Her hands shaking, she broke open the shotgun, slid 2 heavy brass shells into the barrels, and snapped it shut with a loud, definitive click. She didn't know if she could fire it, but she could load it. She began the slow, methodical process of reloading the empty pistols and rifles they had, her nimble seamstress's fingers quickly adapting to the new, grim task of handling lead and powder. The battle raged. A bullet smashed through one of the smithy's windows, showering the room with glass. Another thudded deep into the wooden door. A fist of lead just inches from Caleb's head. He didn't flinch. He just kept firing, his shots measured and deadly. He was not a man of words, but with a rifle in his hands. He spoke a language his enemies understood perfectly. A cry of pain came from outside. "John Miller's been hit," someone yelled. Eliza's head snapped up. Through the smoke, she saw the homesteader slump down behind a water trough, his wife Sarah trying to drag him to safety, while bullets kicked up dust all around them. The nurse, the caregiver who had tended to Caleb's wounds, surged to the forefront. "Cover me!" she yelled, already moving toward the door. "Eliza!" "No," Caleb's voice was a sharp command. But she was already gone. She grabbed a canvas horse blanket, dipped it in a bucket of water, and, holding the dripping heavy shield before her, she ran out into the hell of the main street, the noise of the gunfire a physical blow. A bullet hissed past her ear. She did not stop. She reached the trough, threw the wet blanket over Sarah and her wounded husband, and dropped to her knees. John's leg was a bloody mess. "It's a tourniquet. You need a tourniquet," she shouted to Sarah over the din, ripping a strip from her own petticoat. She worked with frantic, desperate speed, her hands covered in the man's blood, showing the terrified woman how to tie it, how to tighten it, how to stop the bleeding. Her act of selfless courage seemed to momentarily stun both sides into a lull. In that brief window, Caleb and Mr. Blackwood laid down a barrage of covering fire, forcing Croft's men back. They dragged John and the two women into the relative safety of the smithy. The momentary respite was broken by a new, more direct assault. The Dunn brothers, tired of the standoff, were leading a charge directly at the smithy. "They're coming!" Martha screamed. Caleb met them at the door, his Winchester empty. He drew his Colt, firing twice. One of the riders went down, but Jed Dunn was already off his horse, a massive shotgun in his hands. He kicked the door, the wood groaning and splintering. "It's over! Thorne!" he roared. Mr. Blackwood fired his revolver wildly through the door, but the shots went wide. Jed kicked it again, and the lock burst. The door flew open, and the two brothers stood there, silhouetted against the fiery, smoky light. Caleb fired his last shot, hitting Marcus in the shoulder and spinning him around, but Jed was already leveling his shotgun, its twin barrels a black promise of death aimed directly at Caleb's chest. There was no time. Caleb was defenseless. In that frozen split second of impending death, a shape moved in the darkness of the forge. It was Eliza. In her hands was the loaded shotgun Martha had given her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but her hands were steady. She did not aim. She did not think. She simply brought the heavy weapon up, pointed it at the center of the doorway, and pulled both triggers. The shotgun's roar was a deafening, apocalyptic blast that dwarfed all other sounds. The recoil was a brutal, physical punch that threw Eliza back against the wall, her shoulders screaming in agony. The cloud of smoke was so thick she couldn't see, her ears ringing. But through the smoke, she saw that the doorway was empty. Jed Dunn and his shotgun were gone, blasted back into the street. The charge was broken. The ferocity of the shotgun blast, the sudden, brutal end of one of their leaders, seemed to shatter the morale of Croft's men. They hesitated, their attack faltering, and in that moment of hesitation, the town fought back with a renewed fury. The homesteaders, seeing what Eliza had done, surged forward. Sheriff Elias charged out of the saloon, his pistols blazing. The tide of the battle had turned. Croft's riders began to fall back, then to rout, galloping away in a disorganized panic. Soon, the only ones left in the street were the dead, the wounded, and a single, stunned figure on horseback, Silas Croft. He sat on his expensive stallion, his tailored suit now covered in dust, his face a mask of disbelief. His army was gone. His power had evaporated in a cloud of gun smoke. He looked at the smithy at the small group of defiant, blood-soaked people standing in the doorway. His eyes met Eliza's. He saw no fear in them now, only a cold, hard finality. His face twisted in a snarl of pure hatred. He raised his own pistol, not at Caleb, but at her. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he was going to have his revenge. Before he could fire, a shot cracked from the end of the street. It wasn't loud, but it was precise. Croft's gun flew from his hand. He cried out, clutching a shattered wrist. Caleb stood 20 yards away, a small derringer he'd had tucked in his boot in his hand. He hadn't killed him. He had simply disarmed him, broken him, taken the last of his power. The battle was over. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise it replaced. The dust began to settle, revealing the terrible cost of the fight. The street was littered with broken glass and spent shells. 2 townsmen lay dead. Several more were wounded, along with John Miller. But they had won. Eliza let the heavy shotgun fall from her numb fingers. Her shoulder was a single, throbbing point of agony. Her ears rang. Her dress was torn and stained with blood and gunpowder. She looked at her hands, the hands of a seamstress, now raw and trembling from the violence they had committed. Caleb walked slowly toward her, his face grim, a fresh blood stain spreading on the bandage at his side where his wound had reopened. He stopped in front of her, his gray eyes searching her face. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a smudge of gunpowder from her cheek. They stood there, in the middle of the carnage, 2 survivors in a world of dust and death. They had fought together, bled together, and faced down the demons of their world, side by side, the last barrier between them, the last echo of their different pasts, had been burned away in the fires of battle. They were no longer a cowboy and a lady. They were simply a man and a woman who had found, in the heart of the unforgiving West, something worth fighting for. In the aftermath of the battle, there was no victory parade. There was only the grim, silent work of tending to the living and honoring the dead. The smoke cleared to reveal a town scarred and bleeding, but a town that had survived. And in that survival, a new, fragile order began to emerge. Eliza Reed, the woman who had arrived as a mysterious outsider, became the heart of the town's recovery. The same hands that had stitched torn denim now stitched torn flesh. Doc Adams, sobered by the violence and humbled by his own inadequacy, became her assistant, fetching water and holding lanterns while she worked with a calm, focused intensity that awed him. She moved from the wounded homesteaders to Croft's own men, who had been abandoned by their leader in his flight, and she tended to them with the same impartial care. There was no room for hatred in the face of such suffering. There was only the work. The women of the town, who had once whispered about her behind their hands, now brought her bowls of broth and clean linens. They watched her, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. They saw not the fallen woman of their gossip, but a figure of immense strength and compassion. Sarah Miller, her husband John resting as comfortably as possible with a splinted leg, never left Eliza's side, acting as her tireless nurse. One afternoon, as Eliza was changing a dressing, Sarah took her hand, her eyes swimming with tears. "We would have lost everything without you, Miss Reed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just our homes. We would have lost our hope." Even Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, was silenced. She said nothing, her sour expression unchanged, but when Eliza finally stumbled back to her room, exhausted and blood-spattered, she found a fresh pitcher of warm water waiting for her, and a plate of food left on her nightstand. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. The town was beginning to see her, not through the lens of their own narrow prejudices, but for who she truly was. Caleb Thorne, his own wound painfully reopened, worked alongside Sheriff Elias and Mr. Blackwood, restoring order. He directed the grim task of burying the dead. He helped round up Croft's scattered men, disarming them and locking them in the livery stable to await the arrival of the U.S. Marshal that Eliza's letter had summoned. The marshal arrived 2 days later, a stern, weary man who took one look at the battered town, listened to the sheriff's report, and immediately issued a warrant for the arrest of Silas Croft for insurrection and murder. The town had been saved, its future secured not by distant laws, but by the courage of its own people. And at the center of that courage stood two figures who had, until now, lived on its fringes. The townspeople looked at Caleb, and they no longer saw just a solitary, capable hand. They saw a leader, a man who had put himself between them and destruction. They looked at Eliza, and they no longer saw a scandalous mystery. They saw a hero. But acceptance from the town and the private truth of what lay between them were two very different things. The battle had forged a bond of fire and blood between Caleb and Eliza, but the quiet, uncertain landscape of what came next was a territory more frightening than any battlefield. A week after the fight, as the last of the wounded were on the mend and a semblance of normalcy had returned, Caleb found Eliza sitting alone on the porch of the Blackwoods cottage. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Her sewing basket lay forgotten at her feet. She was staring out at the vast, empty plains, her expression distant and troubled. Her right shoulder, where the shotgun had kicked her, was still wrapped in a bandage. He stood before her, a tall, silent shadow against the fading light. She looked up, and for a moment, he saw in her eyes the same fear and vulnerability she had shown the night he was wounded. The violence had left its own invisible scars. "Your shoulder," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. "It will heal," she replied quietly. "It is other things that ache." She looked down at her hands, lying limp in her lap. These hands, they were meant for needlepoint and pouring tea. They were not meant for this. I took a man's life. Caleb. He sat down on the step below her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the steady warmth of his presence. He looked out at the same darkening plains, his face carved in shadow. "Jed Dunn made his choice a long time ago," he said, his voice flat and hard. "He chose a life of hurting people for money. He came here to burn and to kill. You didn't take his life. You saved the lives of everyone in this cottage. There's no sin in that." "In my world," she whispered, "there is the world I came from. It has no place for a woman who has done what I have done." "Then maybe it's a good thing you're not in that world anymore," he said simply. They sat in silence for a long time, the first stars beginning to prick the dark velvet of the sky. The chasm between their pasts was still there, a ghost that sat between them. She was a woman of refinement, forced into brutality. He was a man of brutality who possessed a silent, unexpected grace. They were a contradiction, a puzzle that didn't seem to fit. "The marshal says Croft won't ever come back," he said, changing the subject. "They'll see he's put away for a long time. The homesteaders are drawing up new water rights agreements. The town will be safe now." "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do?" It was the question that hung between them, the one that truly mattered. His work here was done. He was a man of the open range, a man who had never put down roots. He was free to go, to ride away and disappear back into the vast, lonely landscape that had formed him. He could leave the complications, the gossip, the memory of blood and fever behind him. He turned his head and looked at her. In the dim light, his gray eyes were dark pools of an emotion she couldn't read. "I was thinking of buying the miller's old plot," he said, his voice quiet. "The one up by the bend in the creek. It's got good water. A man could build a small house there, raise a few horses." Eliza's heart, which she thought had been numbed by the events of the past week, gave a single, painful jolt. He was talking about a future, a settled future, here. But he said nothing more. He did not say the word we. He did not speak of us. He had laid the pieces of a life on the table, but he did not invite her to help him build it. The choice, she realized, was still hers. He would not presume. He would not ask. He had shown her who he was, and now she had to decide if his world, a world of harsh beauty, quiet strength, and the constant, looming possibility of violence, was one in which she could live. Could she, Eliza Reed of Philadelphia, truly become a woman of the West? Could she build a life with this silent, difficult, honorable man, knowing that their peace would always be a fragile thing, a small, protected flame in a vast and often brutal wilderness? He stood up, the movement slow and a little stiff. "It's getting late," he said. "Time to go." It was the same phrase he had used every evening. It was the beginning of their ritual, their silent walk back to the boarding house. But tonight, it was different. It was not just an offer of escort. It was an offer of a path, a shared path, leading into an unknown future. She looked up at him, standing tall against the starlit sky. He was not a fairy tale prince. Their life would not be a fairy tale. It would be hard. It would be a struggle. There would be times of fear and hardship. The ghosts of both their pasts would surely follow them. The town might respect them now, but it would never fully understand them, their love. If that is what this powerful, unspoken thing between them was, would never be a simple, easy thing. It would be a choice they would have to make every single day. He offered her his hand, not his arm, in that formal, defiant gesture from the dance, but his open hand. It was a simple, honest invitation. His hand was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who worked and fought for his place in the world. It was a hand that had saved her, and a hand she had held while he trembled in the grips of a fever. She placed her own hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He pulled her gently to her feet. They stood for a moment, facing each other in the quiet darkness. The whole world shrunk to the small space between them. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges. But for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Eliza Reed felt not fear, but a deep and profound sense of peace. She was home. She looked up into his face, into the steady gray eyes that had seen the very worst and the very best of her, and she smiled. It was not the polite, distant smile of a society lady, nor the weary, strained smile of a survivor. It was a smile of pure, unadorned truth, a smile of acceptance, a smile that said, without a single word, that she was ready to walk beside him, wherever the trail might lead. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.